Many people, including most economists, and actually most politicians, especially in capitalist countries, sort of believe that the world of business will improve automatically and things will get better. And that's because our world is Darwinian, including the world of business, meaning that firms with, say, bad strategies and bad practices will have to compete with firms with good strategies and good practices. And actually, the firms with bad strategies and bad practices will lose, as a result of which they will gradually shrink and disappear. And the bad practices will disappear with them, and our world will get better. Unfortunately, though, they're wrong. And that's not because Darwin is wrong, but because it's a little bit more complex than that. And I'd like to give you an example. I'd like to start with an example. I've been at the London Business School now. I've been there a professor for 13 years. And I also moved to the UK then, of course. And when I had just arrived, I started working with a large newspaper company called The Guardian. And The Guardian owns The Guardian newspaper and also The Observer. And until then, I had always assumed that newspapers were this big simply because it was cheaper to print on big sheets of paper. And slightly to my surprise, I found out that that was not the case at all. In fact, it was slightly more expensive to print big sheets of paper. So I asked them, why do you do it? It's hugely impractical. I was traveling to London Business School by tube every morning and didn't make me very popular with my neighbors. So I said, why don't you make them smaller? And then they said the following to me. They said, no, Freek. Customers wouldn't want it. I think customers wouldn't want it, why not? Well, you know, that's the way it is, and that's how it always has been. Quality newspapers are broadsheet, are big, that's the way it is. All right. Then a few years later, as the first newspaper in the world, The Independent halved the size of its newspaper and saw a surge in its circulation, which basically saved them from bankruptcy. Then The Times, half a year later, halved the size of its newspaper and saw a surge in circulation. Then even The Guardian a couple of months later said, all right, and they made their newspaper smaller and saw a surge in circulation. In fact, after that, we've seen this small-sized newspaper spread all over the world, I assume including in Belgium. Yes, customers, we did want it. And why wouldn't we? It's more practical. So then I looked into where this practice actually had come from to print these ridiculously large sheets of paper, because nobody could tell me. So I went to the British Library and all that, and after some digging around, I found out that this practice started at a very precise location at a very precise point in time, namely the year 1715 in England. In 1715, the then English government decided to start taxing newspaper companies based on the number of pages that they printed. After which these newspaper companies said, well, we'll just make them this big and print as few of them as possible. Well, this tax law was abolished in 1855. But ever since, newspapers just kept printing on these very large sheets of paper, saying, well, that's what it is. Everybody's been doing it this way always. That must be the best way to do things. Of course, now we know they're wrong. But it gives a hint of why it's so difficult to get rid of bad management practices. Because if everybody does it, and everybody has always been doing it this way, it's very difficult to spot that doing it in a different way actually might work better. And that's why I call it collective inertia. In a way, that also explains where they come from, these bad management practices. Namely, they may have come about at a time when it was a perfectly good practice. It's just that the world has changed, and now it's not a good practice anymore, but that we just continue doing it like that. I have to say, though, that I think there's a stronger case even. Sometimes bad management practices even come into existence bad, and they still spread and continue to persist. And let me give you another example of that. It's actually a research project that I recently completed with my colleague, Mahela Stan, who's now at University College London, on the UK IVF industry, so fertility clinics. Fertility clinics in the UK and in many countries have to publish their success rate. Fortunately, for fertility clinics, it's pretty objective what is a success or not. Right? If the treatment was a success, you'll see after a few months. And that is indeed the success rate that they have to publish, the percentage of treatments that results into a live birth. They have to publish that, and hence it greatly influences, as you can imagine, consumer choice. Because most fertility clinics are private clinics. If you're buying this very expensive treatment, of course you're going to go online, and there's a central website, and you're going to look at, is this clinic any good? And if not, I'll select a different one. So it hugely influences consumer choice. And therefore, it was also done by the British government to increase transparency in the business and increase consumer choice. However, it's had an unintended and sort of nasty consequence. Because the success rate of a fertility clinic does not only depend on how good the clinic is, it also depends on who comes through the door. You could say the quality of the input. Some women are easier to get pregnant than others, put it that way. So, and these clinics, they start to, some more than others, pre-select their patients. So, for example, if a 43-year-old woman knocks on the door with one ovary and says, oh, I've been trying for 8 years, they think, oh gosh, and they find ways to refuse her. Say another clinic is more suitable for you or so. If, in contrast, a 23-year-old shows up in perfect health who has been trying for half a year, they say, all right, then. And that's what they do. They more or less pre-select their patients to get easy patients, thinking, well, then we'll boost our success rate. Now, what my colleague Mihaela and I did is we measured from all the fertility clinics in the UK how many difficult patients they did, the proportion of difficult patients they treated, and their success rate. And then we found the following. Well, basically as you would expect. Clinics with a low proportion of poor prognosis patients, they only do the 23-year-olds, they have a very high success rate. Clinics that also let everyone in, also difficult patients, have a much lower success rate, as you would expect. But then, if you permit me to say, I think we did something clever. We didn't only measure their success rate and the proportion of difficult patients, we also measured their so-called learning curve. And a learning curve is what every organization has, that most organizations become better with experience. So on the horizontal axis, we put their cumulative experience, the cumulative number of patients that they treated. And then we saw the following. The clinics that only did 23-year-olds, only easy patients, improved very little over time. But the clinics, who initially had much lower success rates, who also did a lot of difficult patients, improved much quicker. In fact, they improved so much quicker that after about a year or so, they would overtake the clinics who thought they were being clever by only doing easy patients, and became better as a result of that. So 3 to 5 years later, these clinics had much higher success rates in spite of doing many more difficult patients. So you could say these clinics that thought they were being clever by only treating easy patients, they were shooting themselves in the foot, because after a few years they were on the back foot. However, clinics just continue to do this. In fact, this practice of selecting easy patients is still increasing in popularity. And you ask, why? Well, first of all, because silly they don't read my research. But more importantly, it's because they don't understand it. They can see the short-term consequences of their actions. Hey, if we only select easy patients, our success rate goes up, but they cannot see the long-term consequences of their actions. Not even when they're in the long term. Because these clinics, after 5 years, they can see, hey, our success rate is lower, but they have much trouble understanding why that is. They have trouble understanding the causal connection, meaning saying, our success rate is so low because 5 years ago we started selecting only easy patients. That they don't see. And that's what I call management myopia. We, including managers, including organizations, see the short-term consequences of our actions, but not necessarily understand the long-term consequences. And therefore, these practices spread and continue to persist. So that's why I'm calling it management myopia. Now, arguably, it's also pretty difficult to catch these bad management practices. For this reason, but for another one as well. And that is because we often make our own reality come true. And let me explain that through an example as well. This is an example on film distributors. So not companies making films, but the ones putting them in cinemas. And this is a research project by my then colleague, Olaf Sørensen, together with a colleague, David Wagospak. He's now at Yale, but at the time he was at London Business School. He did this research on film distributors, and he asked them basically, what do you need to see in a film for you to think that this will become a success at the box office? So he was looking for predictors of box office success. And basically, Olaf and David, well, through this, came up with a list that you and I could have made over lunch. Because they said, well, you know what? The number of stars on the cast is a good predictor of box office success. And for example, the combined experience of the production team, or the prior number of box office successes that this director has had. These are all excellent predictors of box office success. Well, Olaf and David, for hundreds of films, measured all these things, measured their box office success through a statistical model called a regression analysis, and showed that, yes, they were right. These were predictors of box office success. Now, they could have left it at that, and that would be pretty boring. But they took one more step. They said, let us also measure how much resources these film distributors assign to their different films that they purchase. For example, marketing budget, or number of opening screens, or time of the year that they have the film, because some times of the year are better than others. And then they found the following. Said, well, films with these characteristics get assigned more resources, like marketing budget. And indeed, films with more resources, like marketing budget, do better at the box office. But, interestingly, when they did this, in their statistical models, the original relationship completely disappeared. Now, what does this mean? This means that their prior beliefs about predictors of box office success were complete nonsense, had nothing to do with box office success. The one and only reason why films with these characteristics indeed did better at the box office is because they invested more resources in them. Because they thought, hey, these films will do better, therefore we'll give them a better marketing budget. And indeed, then they did better at the box office. And they said, see, how good are we? We already knew this beforehand. No, in fact, you just made your own beliefs come true. But you would have been better off had you assigned these resources differently, even randomly. And that's what I call self-perpetuating myths. We have certain beliefs about what will work or not, and then we invest our time, our effort, and our financial resources according to these beliefs, in the process making them come true. And then in hindsight we think that we were right, but of course we were wrong. Now that also makes it very hard to catch these erroneous beliefs and bad management practices, because we make them come true, and at the end it seems as if we were correct, but we were not. Therefore, if there's one thing that I hope you will remember from this little talk, it's this. Just because everybody does it this way, and just because everybody has always been doing it this way in your organizations and your industries, that doesn't mean that this is the best way of doing things. In fact, bad management practices can spread and can persist for years, decades, centuries, or even longer. And that's because of these three reasons. Collective inertia, everybody does it this way, the newspaper example. Because of management myopia, the fertility clinics who see the short-term consequences. And because of self-perpetuating myths, the example of the film distributors, we make our own reality come true. But that doesn't mean that they're actually good practices.